Is that working? Oh, great. Actually, Ellis, that wasn't the longest and hardest project at the Courtauld. A very tiny housing scheme in Belgium for 13 small apartments was much longer. Okay, can I say two things that aren't scripted? So a big call out for Jane Allison, because that show is amazing. Go see it. Absolutely brilliant. Courageous, brave, and brilliant. And I think Debbie's here too. And thank you for coming, Debbie, as well. 18 years at the Courtauld. Total rock. Thank you. Okay. Right, we're going to reflect this evening on 4 projects that we've spent the last 8 years working on. They're not all completed, so this reflection's premature and undigested, but I think that's a good position from which to share some thoughts. We're going to discuss the 4 projects through the lens of rooms and families of rooms, of the micro and the macro, trying to think about complexity by zooming in. I don't know if anyone recognizes that image. I didn't. This is a term, the cellular was a term coined by Robert Hooke in his seminal paper for the Royal Society in 1665. He's an architect and collaborator with Wren, and he noted when looking at cork bark through an early microscope that it was made up of lots of walls enclosing small voids. A cellular structure, recognizing as an architect would the resemblance to small monastic walled rooms. So cell derives from the word room in Latin and acts as a direct and useful link tonight between the world of living things and the world of built things. So for tonight's reflection, we'll explore the idea of series of rooms, families of things, resemblances, how cellular things have a social identity, and how people self-order through cellular things. 10 years ago, we were in the process of finishing Astley Castle. We had very little work and found ourselves doing 20 design competitions in 2 years with an office of 7 people. We lost 19, no sour grapes there yet. It was expensive, it was exhausting, and it was emotionally draining, although intriguing to work on such interesting challenges with almost no dialogue with any client. The one we won was a mixed blessing, and you definitely won't be hearing about that tonight. In 2014, with the help of the Stirling Prize for Astley Castle, we won the next 4 projects we competed for, and these are the subject for tonight. Top left. Oh, works. An art historical institute and gallery on the Strand, a new cafe and support space for a Cambridge college, a contemporary almshouse in Bermondsey for a charity with housing and shared facilities for older people, and a centre for small businesses in Hoxton. These were all won with an approach and an interview, with a test of our ideas and personality rather than any fixed proposals, enabling us to work with knowledgeable and committed clients to develop and refine the designs. 2 are adaptations of existing buildings, the other 2 are new build, as you'll see. 1 is cellular masonry construction, 2 are skeletons. The 4th, concrete shear wall and flat slab. 1 is completed, 1 is almost complete, 1's half complete, and 1 is still under construction. Although they're tailored and co-authored, there are several threads that connect them. Firstly, they're all institutions of a kind, constellations of individuals within a collective. Secondly, to borrow Louis Kahn's beautiful phrase, we've considered them as families of rooms, in terms of the relation of the individual to the collective and as spaces for encounter and sharing. So each family of rooms has a grain, a system of communication, a hierarchy, configurations of protection and porosity, of thresholds and connections. Their urban surrounds can also be considered a family of rooms, a cellular structure of plots and clearings. There are 3 particularly strong reasons to look at these projects through this lens, because the grain of a building and the character of its constituent rooms is the most durable characteristic. Because this durability is also a basis for flexibility and adaptation as institutions grow and evolve. And because thinking of the totality of rooms usefully blurs the distinction between the adaptation of the existing and the foundation of the new. It's something that combines multiple authors into a single whole. And because it's a way into a reflection on how buildings and cities serve forms of social organisation and indeed self-organisation. The families of rooms offer a structure to formal and informal collectives, working through linked sequences and scaled to the shared situation or the intimate moment. So the first of the four, the Courthold Institute of Art. So the Courthold, for those of you that don't know, combines the research and study of the history of art, the practice and teaching of conservation, and the curation of varied collections. It has the potential to become a remarkable unity of the different facets of art under one roof. Founded in 1932 and inspired by an American model for teaching art history at the FOG, the Courtauld began at Home House, which was the rented residence of Samuel Courtauld in a Georgian terrace defining Portman Square. The Courtauld grew in increments of house as collections were donated and student numbers grew. As art collections were left to the institution, a separate gallery was constructed at Woburn Place in Bloomsbury. But by the late 1970s, the lease was up for expiry on the houses, and the Courtauld needed a new home. Somerset House was designed by William Chambers in 1778 on the site of the medieval Somerset House Palace. The Strand block to the north is not exactly what it appears. This is a rendering of that time from Somerset House Courtyard, looking at that Strand block, and through the vestibule would be the Strand running at the back. The singular palatial facade never enclosed a palace. As you can see from an early plan, what it actually enclosed was almost like a folded terrace of Georgian houses, each with their own entrance and staircase. So Chambers Building was designed to house 9 institutions in suites of rooms. You can see the key ones amongst those were the Royal Academy, the Royal Society, which Hooke had been part of, and the Society of Antiquaries. They shared the central part of the Strand block, and they didn't like sharing. So, although it was designed to house 9 institutions, it was also designed to ensure that they were divided from each other. So when the Courtauld moved from Portman Square to Somerset House in 1989, Yeah, I think so. They took their spatial structure of departments and houses with them and occupied Chambers Terrace in a similar way. The old hierarchical suites of rooms that served each institution in Chambers' time combined the practical with the ceremonial. You can see those rooms unsuited. Because habits and the inherited buildings at the Courtauld were established, they divided this unity into their separate specialisms with minimal contact and little shared space. The large rooms went to the display of the collections, and the smaller rooms were used for academic offices and the small group teaching model. The 50 level changes and separate suites of rooms were tentatively and tortuously linked in the 240 years since it was first occupied. Our work consisted of making linkages with the parts, working with the cellular logic of the Strand block to connect the suites of rooms to each other. So that division manifested itself when the Courtauld originally moved into the galleries, some student facilities with a research forum, lecture theatre and cafe. And our project looked to extend the galleries across the whole of the second floor, re-establishing the volume and the light in the great room, and then tunnelling through the lower ground floor vaults to connect the existing east and west staircases, making a circuit of movement that could bind together the different departments and the different activities, opening those up or throttle them down as necessary. This required some major interventions. This is a sort of doll's house section looking with the courtyard behind you, looking back towards the Strand. That's the vestibule. So that shows the galleries that were reworked and added on the second floor, the tunnelling through the vaults below, new lifts, or lifts repurposed and rebuilt within the shafts, new staircase, and new gallery spaces, visitor reception and staircases. So we connected the separate staircases and fragmented structure of rooms with a series of cuts and carvings and new levels to create this interconnected set of rooms. We worked with each room in its own right and based on its specific conditions. But as you can imagine, because of the nature of Chambers' architecture, designing for the different societies, they were extremely varied. And so this combination of working with the rooms also had to be tempered by finding a series of family resemblances. And we were looking, therefore, at how, this is a shot inside one of those models, how the architecture of the new gallery spaces or the new shared spaces had a family resemblance to both Chambers' architecture, but also to themselves in terms of all of the sort of details that went with that. And what we actually built, because someone did ask me once, what did you actually do? And I agree with Ellis, it's not necessarily self-evident. This is what we actually built, which feels like we got paid quite a lot of money for what we did. So what we actually built was a topography of small ruins, of kind of incomplete fragments, carving out and cutting through to create new openings, excavating new levels, and constructing new transitions and thresholds. You can see these are the new vaults, which I'll talk about, these huge portals to get movement through at the lower ground floor, the new stairs, changes at the threshold for access in at the doors, and then a whole series of deep thresholds connecting what were once secondary service spaces into that public circuit and new gallery spaces on that second floor. So on the lower ground floor, you can see on the left was the existing plan. That's the central block here with a series of 3 long vaults. And what we did was take out the central vault completely, prop the whole building while we did it, propped a road over the top so they could still deliver into Somerset House, and cut through these walls to make a large volume lower ground floor space that connected the east and the west staircases. And that was a kind of really a way of excavating new openings through these massive masonry walls, casting the concrete as you go in order to reduce the amount of propping through the heaviest bearing walls. And then there was the slicing through, literally a big cheese wire. You can see the marks on the brickwork, and cutting away the central vault. Extraordinary work in really difficult conditions. Incredible workmen carefully going through a sequence of that while the whole building was propped. Propping and setting the formers for a new central vault that provided the headroom to connect through that basement, and then a single pour of self-compacting in situ concrete, one pour into the whole thing. What you get is what you're left with. And you can see that starts to connect directly into those existing brick vaults either side, and we were connecting with the grain of existing brick cross vaults. So that the new structure is completely embedded into the existing structure. It shares its characteristics in terms of geometry, alignment, dimension, and it bears and supports those existing vaults. It absolutely does what it looks like it's doing. We were embedding new staircase, cantilevered stone staircase in the manner of Chambers, part of that kind of family resemblance, but quite secondary in its materiality and its detailing. And then at first floor, there's this extraordinary kind of structure that revealed itself, that a huge timber truss bridging between two of the cross walls, creating the central 2 rooms, fine rooms, like someone had just moored a giant ship at the edge of the Strand from the Thames. The carpentry and the scale of it in the building is extraordinary. And then on the very top floor, second floor, this was the existing condition that we had. There was chambers, there was the Royal Academy stair, and the antechamber came through into the Great Room. The Great Room at that point was subdivided into 4 with a very low ceiling across them. This was created at the request of William Turner in 1811, which was an additional gallery. And then there was some small, these were the old domestic attic spaces of the Royal Society's Society of Antiquaries, and served as gallery offices, toilets, and the paper conservation. And what we looked to do was follow the logic of the cellular structure, creating 2 new galleries on the east side, reflecting the 2 on the west side, connecting right through to the 2 staircases, and re-establishing, most importantly, the volume of the Great Room. And you can see this is actually standing in the Great Room, looking towards where those new galleries were created. The behind of that is this, and you can see there's a whole language of existing fireplaces and historic flues, which is what we were intervening in. This is what we ended up cutting through there, making this steel portal right the way through, closing up the old door in the corner to create a link between antechamber right through to the east staircase, and a modern chimney, which was dealing with huge volumes of air from the Great Room and the new galleries, which were all then lined out tight to the existing original linings with the new gallery walls. And then where those small domestic spaces were, we put in these huge steel portals and beams, picking up the new plant rooms, and then creating the support for these very lightweight fibrous plaster coving details, picking up the geometry of William Chambers. And it was an interesting accident when you find a photo on your phone on its side, but it just made it clear about this idea of family resemblances, where the in situ poured concrete of the lower ground floor and the vaults and the fibrous plaster coving geometry were all part of the same family of thinking and kind of coherence within the building. So this is what happened down in the vaults when those cross tunneling all had been completed, with the new openings through and connecting into the small cellular masonry spaces at either end. New staircase taking you from lower ground floor to the new visitor reception on the ground floor, cantilevered stone. And then altering the levels and creating access at the thresholds in the vestibule, the external doors, with these solid new stones that just took the existing and eased those ramps so you could get in at both front doors, not previously possible. These very deep thresholds that link the staircases to small new galleries, really diversifying the range of art that the Courtauld can show and the programs it can deliver. Making modest suites of new rooms and galleries where that was possible on the first floor, in rooms that were previously small offices and indeed a toilet. Again, enabling collections to be viewed that had previously not been, hadn't had a place, and more importantly also enabling curators to take risks and for student work and conservation practice to be on public view. Opening up really and decluttering those thresholds in the Great Room so you get a very seamless enfilade through each of those, and then reopening and gaining the original proportions of the antechamber, the historic RA sequence, through into the Great Room, now a single volume with natural light again, and a very, very, an incredible room held up in the sky and imagined by Chambers. And then through these cuts and then into the new galleries on the second floor, connecting back to that staircase. And that just shows you those coved panels, plant rooms either side, huge steel portals around the back of those underneath the timber ones, and then glazed lantern, which brings in very, very gentle natural light through the roof. Seamless.
So Clare College, Cambridge, has some similarities with Somerset House. It's broadly classical in conception, with a central route through from street to court to riverside gardens. And it's mostly one room deep around the court, served by stairs. It was founded in the 14th century, rebuilt in the 15th to make space for King's College Chapel. Building the new college around the retained elements of the old, interrupted by the Civil War, completing in the late 18th century at about the time that Somerset House was starting. The slowness of the rebuild and the turbulent history behind it is kept in a kind of harmony in the stone-faced courtyard, half Gothic, half classical, with the central gateway and a few details tasked to give some classical poise to the utilitarian Gothic of the West Wing. But this gives way to stronger contrast facing the river. A real front and back situation with a smoothly rhythmic facade of pale stone piers and tall windows to the west on the right, and then the north side in earthy brick with jutting, irregular gables and chimneys, and of course King's College Chapel in the background. This sort of amazing skyline. The accidents of a classical institution inserted in medieval surrounds, so the regular in the irregular, a counterpoint beautifully drawn out by Peter Smithson in his Cambridge Walks. And a counterpoint that's legible in the city plan, with the old Anglo-Saxon High Street running north to south on the right, and the courtyards detaching themselves and becoming more regular as they approach the river and water meadows, bending gently in the middle. The battleship in the centre is King's College Chapel, with Clare College, a bishop's move, diagonally above and to the left, with this curious tapering wedge of space at its northern edge, what turned out to be our site. The last buildable space, a sliver 120 metres long, tapering from 1 metre wide on Trinity Lane to 8 metres as it approached the river edge. A real back with bins, boilers, storage. It's where the toilets used to be, hence the Edwardian graffiti, where each brick is marked with a set of initials. And the college comes into view as an accumulation of souls, just as much as it's a pile of bricks and stones. The college has long outgrown its city centre site, so undergraduate and postgraduate accommodation is now in 3 clusters around the city. And every cellar and attic in Old Court has been pressed into service for individual and communal spaces, leaving us facing numerous small questions of access and escape resulting from these incremental changes, but underlaid by the fundamental challenge: how to keep Old Court as the beating heart of college life. And there's the need for more capacity for shared meals, one of the key facets of community life. But that's not just more space. Undergraduates are more diverse, less deferential. Postgraduate and postdoctoral researchers have grown in number and are taking on more teaching responsibilities. And teaching fellows are more international and transient. So the ambition is for a new shared space that stands outside the encoded hierarchy. You can read the hierarchy on this plan, the senior, middle, and junior common rooms, their locations, first floor, ground floor, basement. And you can see it in the stones and in the gestures. Our wedge-shaped site to the north sits outside this cellular logic of chambers on stairs around the central court. Instead, in between two garden walls, it belongs to the landscape and the gardens. So, this is the logic we have adopted. The structure within the garden, like a trellis, with a terrace to the river at the end. So if there's a family of rooms, this is a cuckoo in the nest. Beneath the pastoral landscape of the famous backs, with the stone west facades of the colleges in the afternoon sunlight, and that's King's College Chapel at the centre. This is the deep urban structure, a web of paths and bridges running east to west, between and through the colleges. And garden walls from the colleges to the river, where we have two closely spaced garden walls to work between. So our scheme is a cluster of plumbing, both literal and metaphorical, with a new passenger lift, catering lift, escape stair, pantry, toilet, servery, in a 3-story stack between two existing gables. Yeah. And the cafe, a room between the garden walls, beside the river, terminating in a trellised terrace to the river. We've worked and reworked this room multiple times to carve out a feeling of spaciousness and intimacy between the two walls, glazing the north wall to the right, and pulling it back from the edge, stepping it to restrain this sort of perspective tunnel effect of the wedge, and to create spaces to linger instead. The booths on the right, distinguished from the tables on the left by a lower ceiling and a continuous bench behind the flood defence wall. And roof lights over the tables, and 2 windows cut in the left-hand wall to the master's garden, bringing daylight and air, further daylight and air. It's a carpentry skeleton with wood linings, and hopefully these rhythms and inflections feel natural and easy, but they've been hard won through a push and pull between what's most straightforward structurally and the shaping of the room and the shaping of territories within the room. The vertical cores will also be built in a carpentry skeleton, giving the approach as well as the river room the quality of being a covered exterior space, a single extended threshold. For half the length on the left, we're in between 2 very unequal walls, the 4-story back wall of the north wing and the low garden wall, stepping and pitching. So we've continued the light courts right into the depth to limit the amount that we abut new structure against the figured old walls. This is then light courts coming here right into the gable. The escape stair from the attic rooms is placed against the chimney and indeed connects through the chimney stack to the attic rooms. And the lifts are set away from the existing building like a detached new chimney block. That's number 4 on the plan here. The skeletal stair and the lift tower both talk to the family of forms of the existing building, but their accents come from their internal structure, and their steps come from their internal configuration. So the dialogue of part and whole pushes and pulls at several scales. The north wall is a combination of gables, chimneys, tall windows, and blind windows, to which we add this wooden submarine, with the stack of plumbing on the left and the cafe on the right, with just the conning tower emerging above the brick parapet wall. Obviously not a metaphor that we used with historic England. I must try sometime, but not wide of the mark. Building everything in a timber skeleton helps construction considerably, so it can be prefabricated, off-site, and assembled dry and relatively fast. Because building here is like building a ship in a bottle, with everything brought in small and flat pack across this temporary Bailey Bridge over the River Cam. Before the wooden structure can be installed, there's been much slow work, digging and drilling a drain, stripping the north wall of its accretions. This is the charming assemblage we inherited. Stripped back, and the finishes tacked onto the 17th century brickwork, the erosions in that grand chimney stack, remaking openings to connect back to the screen's passage entrance. And this is a month or so ago, this sort of painstaking work of piecing in. If you see here the L-shaped lintel here, for example, all these new openings cut within the original ordering of that rear wall. Patching up the butchered remains of the old chimney stack, so quite a lot of new elements here reinstating that form, and repointing the mortar joints. So a work of repair, quite restorative in its direction, reinstating the simple rhythms and proportions of the stacks and the openings. So the space between the back of the north wing on the left and the boundary wall has undergone a slow transformation of stripping and then repairing back to this order of generous windows and deep chimneys. And now installing the steel stair and the timber skeleton. The timber frame is laminated oak, which has been meticulously fabricated with every joint prepared for site assembly and numbered. Quite a flat pack. Based on equally meticulous design by Smith & Wallwork structural engineers, designing every junction. Who does that these days? With only screwed connections, not metal connecting plates, as is more common. Of course, all sized for charring to keep it safe in the event of a fire. The timber frame is being installed by a highly skilled 3-person team. That's why I said it was relatively fast. Husband, wife, and son. Installation started a couple of weeks ago and will be complete in 3 months of the frame, working from the narrow end of the passage back out towards the riverside terrace. Already, this was last week, you start to feel the scale of the spaces and the play between the robust brick and the warmth of the oak. The last timber frame structures in Cambridge date from the 16th century, so this is quite a strange throwback, bolstered by the precision of the engineering and the fabrication to build with a durable and sustainable quality. Awaiting its timber frame The river room is a room at last, with its concrete front flood protection bund at low level, the graffiti bricks being repaired on the right, its river wall cut back for the terrace and trellis, and a view of the monumental University Library Tower at the end. A garden room waiting for the garden. It's a major upheaval in the life of the college, one that we hope will re-energize the collective spirit. It's quicker and less traumatic than its late medieval rebuilding, but it's dramatic nonetheless. The scar in the landscape will take a little longer to heal, but then we'll slowly reabsorb this insertion into the pastoral landscape of the backs.
Right, thank you. Almshouse, very close to completion. Our project for the Almshouse in Bermondsey really reimagines the idea of the community of independent older people within the heart of the city. We've designed it for a remarkable charity called United St Saviour's, who were founded in the mid-16th century and based in Bankside in Southwark. The charity already operates this almshouse, which some of you may know. It's sort of behind Tate Modern. It's called Hoxton's Almshouse, and that was built in 1752, so 28 years or so before the Courtauld was completed, and it had 26 homes. You can see all the traditional characteristics of an almshouse as we tend to think of them. The sort of U-shaped plan with a kind of railings to the street, a garden, and I think like the colleges and other institutions of the time, the simple structure of rooms really around a kind of courtyard, but with the distinction, of course, that this courtyard is actually open, typically open to the city. Depending on the institution that funded each almshouse, a small chapel, or in this case, a meeting room for the use of residents was located at the centre of the plan and furthest from the street. So our new build project sits within the same reflection on collective structures as Clare and Courtauld. We were fortunate to be able to meet with existing almshouse residents to understand their relationship to the city around them. For several who had struggled with addictions and mental illness, retirement was an opportunity to start again. It was an opportunity to forge a different life with the community around them, to establish a new relationship across a new threshold. For others, the issue was one of loneliness and how to find new purpose to their lives. Despite the rhetoric of the denser city with better public spaces and public transport, the tragic reality is that loneliness is one of the biggest killers in urban environments. These were pivotal insights for us and shaped our reimagination of how older people might be present in our cities, or perhaps most profoundly, what type of city are we trying to imagine and build? The charity were part of a three-way chess game. A private residential and office development in Bankside was to fund social housing away from their site. Southwark Council had a vacant site on Southwark Park Road in Bermondsey. The charity were looking for a new almshouse to run in perpetuity, and that was a three-way deal. The site was once part of this extraordinary Victorian grain of houses and pubs that provided living accommodation for the huge extent of nearby docks. You can see, it was so coherent and consistent, it's untrue, and we're looking at a site here. Located where the residential terraces of, you've got Longley Street, Met and Reverdy Road meet Southwark Park Road, which is the old high street leading down to the park. But that coherence of Victorian terraces and grain was completely disrupted and altered by extensive bombing for the dock areas and the main railway line into London Bridge. So what was once completely consistent is now almost, the only remaining fragment, and is thus the subject of a conservation area. And that's the site. There was a bomb dropped here and opposite, so that's the site that was left vacant after the war. When we were engaged, that site was occupied by a post-war care home that had been closed and was currently being squatted. Typically, the site was characterized by a kind of skirt of car parking, the building set back from the high street, distancing both its presence and its previous residents. So we wanted to radically change the model of older people's accommodation available because we had a client that was incredibly ambitious. And what really differentiated it was every model we looked at for older people's accommodation, one way or another, were all forms of retreat. So we looked to take that typical arrangement of the almshouse, the kind of U-shaped residential plan, and the courtyard, and instead of putting the shared facilities for the residents at the rear of the site, furthest from the street, we flipped that over and put those shared facilities right on the high street. And then above this two-story arrangement, we then had a further 3 stories of another U-shaped plan, which then sat across the top of that and was then open to the south. That gave us a 5-story building, 57 1- and 2-bedroom flats for independent living, and 2 studio flats for young people wanting to get involved in working with older people. So you can see here the grain of those Victorian terraces that remained intact is extended through the 2-story scale of the new almshouse and its rhythm of 2-story bays and windows, and then a 2-story porch structure onto the high street at the front. You can see that the scale and rhythm of the living rooms, these are the Victorian terrace living rooms through here, just extends through the living rooms and the bay windows of the new apartments. And then they've got their kitchens and bathrooms looking into this central court. And then behind, that's the porch structure onto the high street. You can then see a series of shared rooms for collective use and a kind of glazed bay window looking out onto the street with the bus stop and a generous room set back in here. The compact scale of the courtyard is close. That's the courtyard we proposed. That's it overlaid onto the George Inn, which you might recognize the coaching inn structure, Borough High Street, not very far away. And that showed us that there was a kind of model for this very compact internal court. And interestingly, as we kind of researched that model, the courts were also enclosed by these walkways, many of them of a similar scale, timber open galleries onto that court. And that was something that we found applicable to the way we were imagining the thresholds and organisation of the almshouse. So early sketches, again, showing the sort of idea of a garden court at the centre of this building with a series of walkways. Originally we were thinking maybe having those open and partly glazed, which then wrapped around that, giving access to each of the individual apartments and a collective focus into this external room as we'd imagined it. And then all of this was then to be formed in oak structure. And you can see as we developed that became a glazed court with a garden at the heart, with a lot of seasonal kind of qualities for a kind of, I suppose in some ways, a kind of timepiece at the centre of this movement and ageing, providing this very kind of beautiful kind of external room in this sort of quite dense urban environment. And you can see we established within that a sort of two-storey horizon where the walkway is cantilevered on the north side to give us a maximum footprint for the court on the below it. Also gives us then a lot of shading for those shared rooms onto the high street. And then we stop the residential block at 2 stories on the south side so we get maximum sunlight into the rooms above and into this garden. I'm just going to say, and on that plan, you can see it's got a kink in it both ways. It's like a kind of slightly slipped bow tie, so you get more east and west light deeper into the corners of that court, where it would tend to be the least light. And then wrapping around the garden court, its qualities are sort of extended into the walkway structure. We've got then exposed wooden beams, slatted panelling, quarry tiles, and that takes the texture, the rhythms of light and shadow, and natural materials of the garden into that interior. So it's a kind of an in-between space. And indeed, the walkways were conceived very much as an intermediate threshold between the personal space of the home and the collective activities of the shared room and the high street. Wooden seats and planters create a deep threshold to each front door and allow residents to sit outside their kitchen. Kitchen and bathroom windows draw light and views from the walkway. And then we have these large solid oak frame screens which open to allow the breeze, the warmth, and the bird song of the garden court to flow into that intermediate space of the walkway. This was about a year ago and shows the scale of the 4-storey concrete frame and defining, you can see the beginning of the definition of the garden court, so we're on that roof. And this was prior to the 5th storey of carpentry apartments commencing on the top. And there you got it in section. You can see that idea of the 2-storey horizon really clearly. This is the high street. This is that room we're going to talk about in a second. This is the garden court with the cantilever. And then on top of the 2-storey, we've got these large concrete earth-filled planters, which give the residents both growing spaces and external dining spaces on that roof, which then look directly into the back gardens, the mature back gardens of the Victorian terraces. So it's just the most extraordinary space of clay chimney pots and eaves and sort of bits of trees. And perhaps even more surprisingly, when you look at the elevation of that north block, at the kind of heart of it is this double height cut through that grain of rooms. And that series of rooms is then supported on this huge transfer structure, a sort of concrete table under which the residents can meet and the public can occupy. So that's what we call the garden room, and that's being conceived again as a sort of deep threshold between the scale and openness of the street and intimacy and definition of the garden court. It's a sort of gentle transition to support the shared activities and events between the local community and the residents. And that's a sort of an early sketch of that room, very much again characterized as part of the garden with this bay opening out onto the high street, a 2-storey glazed timber screen with sliding doors that would open to the garden court. And this is very much conceived as a place that anyone in the local area can come in and use. There'll be events co-programmed with local institutions. And instead of residents being served their meals at lunchtime in some kind of miserable lounge, the idea here, which is now being installed, is that in here is a communal kitchen. It's got 8 ranges, and people come together to cook, share their knowledge, join in, wash up, whatever you want to do to be part of something, and then you can eat together. And that's for internal and external use. So this whole idea of trying to break down thresholds, break down inhibitions, grow confidence, grow relationships, embed a group of residents in their community and repurpose some of their opportunities is really part of the programme, part of the architecture, part of the topography of this place. That's the garden room recently. You can see that enormous concrete table under which all of these people can play. It's like going back to being a child, isn't it? And this great kind of opening over to the high street on the left-hand side, and then the garden court on the right. And there'll be these one-story sliding timber screens here, so that can open right up. And that's the cookery school at the back. And then you can see this family of rooms, which we've talked about on these other projects. A grain of narrower frontages with deeper rooms on the east and the west and the south, where we've got more room, and you can get then your living room and your bedroom onto the street, and your kitchen and your bathroom onto the court. And then along that north facade, where above the communal rooms and that table, you've got everything's flipped around the other way because we don't have the depth. So you get your living rooms and bedrooms running onto the street, kitchens and bathrooms at the back, but a much shallower plan. So everything's kind of part of a kind of family of relationships. These are the beginnings of those becoming visible. You can see this is the inverted bay on the first floor. Incredible light, really generous sort of scale. You know, we've got solid oak windows that have come in from Eastern Europe in laminated oak to give us a lot of warmth with the external brick and a lot of kind of long-term robustness. Really beautiful rooms. All the rooms are really encouraging, actually. And then up on that top floor, in the rooms made from carpentry, we've managed to compensate for the reduction in ceiling height by having an open oak joists and timber soffit, and these then huge cuts and bays that then look back towards the city and Bermondsey. So all the rooms are very embedded in this place. And you get that sense from the sort of looking back from the street, where this was an early sketch for that top floor, which is much lighter in its construction and in its finish. That's the kind of reddish-brown, zinc-clad top floor. And then this 4-story kind of monolithic masonry base with this giant cut at the front where the porch really draws through some of the timber oak structure from the courtyard through onto the high street, making a kind of a visibility and a kind of porosity to all of those thresholds into those rooms. That was it earlier on, but what's clear from that, you get a good sense of the sort of inflection as the high street bows one way, the building inflects another, which gives us the space then to make this more generous porch and opening at ground level. And there you can see the big concrete table. And then there's this extraordinary brick, which has come in from Denmark. It wasn't meant to be a brick from Denmark, but that's a different story. But it's come out very well. And this very, very kind of monolithic character with the 2 stories of projecting bricks and some reflection, some absorption, very earthy, in our view, very Bermondsey. And I guess what this really does is it just brings together this idea of reimagining a community within a community, how a family of rooms, internal and externally, support collective living and shared encounters with the surrounding community. It's the opposite of a retreat, we hope. It's a celebration of ongoing life, and the critical nature of this is making sociable cities.
So the Almshouse is about building a community of mutual support. And in a different sense, that community of mutual support is what has formed over the last few years at the Centre for Small Businesses in Hoxton, completed in the summer of 2019. The first of this generation of projects to finish, so therefore the most developed in its social consequences. We designed it for and with the Workspace Group, replacing a low-ceiling 1970s tenement factory. Our site was between the Kingsland Road and the railway viaduct, each which has its rhythm and grain. Before the 1970s factory, the site had been occupied by dead-end streets with tight-packed workers' housing, houses at the scale of a room. This is the area of the site, Caesar Street. The existing building was deep planned with poor daylight, so we demolished it, reusing the foundations on the west side here at the bottom and forming new ones to the east at the top. So even though we made a completely new building of 10,000 square meters above ground, it's the outcome of a number of inherited accidents. This is the foundation plan of dark grey is the new foundations and the light grey are the retained and reused. Our building is both granular and massive. It's about 100 rooms, 98, either side of a light court, 6 meters wide, with the units about 50 to 80 square meters each. So this scale of use locates the building naturally within the cell structure of narrow terrace, house plots, and railway arches. But it's one building, 90 meters long, 24 meters wide at its bulging waist, a battleship with an outer shell of brick. The brick shell is a response to the two conservation areas that it sits beside, but it's also a reflection on the individual and the collective. Angus Bogue, the director of development, described how he imagined people going past on the train, on the viaduct, or on the bus, on their way to a corporate job, seeing the building, and then when they set up their own small firm, renting a room there. And like an attic room in an old palace, the tenants could borrow some grandeur from the collective scale. Nasrall Street to the west was only created by demolition in 1980. And this identity is a back. So we proposed to mark its rhythm, the rhythm of rooms and even of plots, with piers that echoed these sort of broken back walls. And to ennoble the street slightly with textured brickwork bonds. We used the softness of clay and the supple discipline of hand-laid brickwork to shape the outer shell to the irregular side. Refining the design to build with only 7 special bricks, working with a craft brickmaker from North Germany, Bockhorn, who showed their great ability to customize and refine to make this family of specials with consistent tonal and color variation on the different faces, which is far from easy. The brick has a color spectrum from deep purple to blush pink, passing through mud brown. It has a reflective skin, so the long sides, which are only seen at an angle, come alive with changes of light and sun. The steps and folds ease the transitions and mark the thresholds. The upper levels here on the right are visually lightened with this ribbed brick. The west elevation faces the most ragged existing condition, so has the most articulation, with projecting piers that echo the plot structure and spandrel panels in a basket weave texture. You can probably just see here. On the smooth, lean east side, Lynn Kinnear, landscape architect, designed a series of gardens that reprise the old house plots, with low brick walls, a wooden deck, and a delicate palette of planting. And then even you see here the fireplaces of the old houses recalled, echoed with black and white tiling. From the south, it's tall and narrow, and the stepping terraces on the left are echoed or combine with the eroded corner here, this cantilever corner, on the bottom right to unbalance it like a toppling house. The north end, where you enter, has a stepping gable like a Hanseatic house, framing this large entrance door, and that racy orange glazed brick signage. The slow craft of laying 500,000 bricks by hand took the best part of a year and was enabled by the speed with which the steel frame was erected. With dry modular construction weatherproofing the building sufficiently for the services and finishes to proceed while the brickwork went up independently. The inner skeleton of steel, built around a 6-metre wide slot, which is a little bit street with doors and windows, and a little bit 19th century institutional, with galleries around a narrow void. It's both a representational space and a route for all the plumbing and wiring up and along. Faces almost precisely south, so it's cut by the summer and winter sun. And by the stairs starting at the north end here on the left and working their way up, with then a series of bridges that step along the length, connecting the two sides. The interactions of the irregular site, the inherited foundations, the services systems, the demands of smoke, ventilation, versus plumbing versus light, create this natural variety of spaces, what I called here a non-mechanical richness. And the skeleton forms the interior is both open and adaptable. It responds to the eccentricities of the site, and this non-mechanical richness forms this variety of units which have a common logic, but a wide range of scales. With these 98 units, mostly 50 to 80 square meters, but some of them are as small as 12 square meters, and the one at the top is 400. A good small business centre is an ecosystem of businesses. It's a mutuality. In Workspace's best buildings, firms do up to 30% of their turnover with other firms in the same building. And this is what we tried to enable here, moving from a typical model of a floor plate with a corridor to something much more open. It's a very simple structure, one room deep, around a long central light court with galleries serving each level. So in this sense, like a squashed, elongated version of the Arms House. The units are simple, well-daylit spaces, like a warehouse or a factory, robust, direct, generous. The tenants are designers, music producers, IT specialists. There's a bridal gown workshop and a modelling agency opposite each other. The common spaces are bridges between the galleries, linked by an open stair that weaves from the centre to the edge up to the summit. And these modest, certainly modest in area terms, bridge spaces are where the 600 or so people who work in the building unwind, eat their lunch together, or have a coffee, hold meetings, or have a coffee, or bump into each other and trade or develop projects together. It's very utilitarian, mostly steel and brick, a little bit domestic, timber floors and doors, actually very beautiful. It's a larch end-grain wood block, rather similar to the one beneath your feet. And the daylight, the wood and the daylight give it a visual warmth. And the galleried central space makes it quite like a theatre, but one where the line between actors and spectators is completely blurred. So to conclude, when Louis Kahn talked about the plan as a society of rooms, he was rejecting the modernist model of undifferentiated space. He was developing tactics for the integration of services and the interweaving of secondary uses. And he was exploring the idea of the institution as an organism with a structure of cells. This is the Trenton bathhouse, which nicely illustrates that logic, almost like a beehive, before it became the Roman house that it was built as, this texture of rectangular rooms and courts. What we've had the chance to do these last 8 years, and which is still very much work in progress, is to work together with quite large, complex organizations, helping them to rebalance, to strengthen the ties between parts and whole, collaborating with knowledgeable and committed clients who really understand what it takes to found something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And to meet this challenge, our small studio has grown from 7 to 20, in which everyone brings knowledge, tenacity, and imagination to this collective work. So these projects are the products of many hands and minds, weaving space and structure side by side and in sequence. So there's a deliberate logic to talk about families of rooms, bestowing personality and social relations on inert things, and finding the order that each of our collectives negotiates and renegotiates. In this sense, these 4 projects for very different uses, very different clients, very varied sites, are a family of projects which consider in a specific way certain structuring questions. Firstly, the idea of the open space in between as a focal common element, an outdoor room. The means of moving through and between as a fundamental part of their social potential, this choreography of encounter. The doorways that demarcate and in a way create that protection. There's layers of protection. And then the spaces that bridge and that belong to both street and interior all are shared. The disposition of individual rooms as a product of their basic equality. So in this sense, quite equal and open configurations. Now, this limited way of looking at buildings, very limited way of looking at buildings, is something that we encountered in the cluster of rooms that we inherited at Astley Castle. We learned to embrace it slowly. And I suppose what it seemed interesting was it's a way of stripping away a lot of distracting thoughts, of demystifying the work of the architect, reducing it to the bare bones, the essentials, making good rooms a lot harder than you might think. Making good rooms, thresholds in between, deep thresholds, and making a kind of social heart, shared rooms, spaces as cemented not by ceremony, but by informal coexistence and encounter. And just as the logic of part and whole operates between detail and constructional discipline, between room and collective, so it holds that between the smaller group and the larger city, that the surrounding streets and squares are a further set of rooms, particularly or at least where the city is still in varied use and multiple ownership. And where the collective, or any of these unconventional collectives, needs a kind of balance of protection and exchange, of enclosure and openness, and where The family of rooms has to be open to unanticipated subdivision or to inconvenient growth. So it's never complete or self-sufficient. It's always a kind of open system of cells. Perhaps when Robert Hooke surveyed the ruins of London in 1666, he saw the correspondences between the organisms under his microscope and the territory of broken walls and posts in front of his theodolite. Working through the disruptions and predations of the last decade, with and for some remarkable like-minded people, we start to see the possibilities of this insight. Thank you very much.